All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Spike and Becky. I'm happy to be a backup. Test your backups, everyone. Yeah, you're going to need your backups. Ask the South Korean government. They lost everything. Was it yesterday or the day before? Because their cloud was just one data center that caught on fire. Yeah, just one cloud, not multi-cloud. Yeah, so my name's Joel. I live like a 10-minute drive from here in a suburb of Boulder. We have two boys, a 2-year-old and a 2-month-old, which is very fun right now. I'm not sleeping a lot, so please don't judge me. Anyways, I work at GitHub as a staff engineer. I now work on Ruby architecture, which is code for working on Ruby and Rails and whatever things are going to help the company in that regard. So over my time at GitHub, I've worked on creating and still maintaining Vue component. I also worked on building out our design system and for a while led our accessibility program. I've been at the company for 7.5 years now, and I still have no plans of leaving. Yes, even to Cisco or Shopify. It feels really weird to say this, especially standing on a stage in public and on the internet, just given how short tenures are in our industry. I love the culture at the company, the problems I get to work on, and the wonderful people I get to work on them with. And that's true just as it was when I joined. And I recognized just standing here and saying that is like a really privileged thing to be doing. So today I'm going to reflect on what I've learned working on GitHub's UI architecture and what lies ahead for our UI architecture discipline in the industry in the future. And my goal is to share our experiences at the company so they can inform similar decisions many of you will make in your careers. Being here for so long has really changed my perspective on being a software engineer. I think one of the greatest parts of working in our single Rails monolithic code base for 7.5 years is that I've got to watch the entire life cycle of my decisions, from idea to prototype to internal release to being publicly available to being widespread adopted to being on keep the lights on support and often being deprecated. There's so much to learn from each of these stages, and we often get them in bits and pieces, but I think that you learn an order of magnitude more from seeing a single idea you have go through all of them. And when you're switching companies every year or 2 or 3, the chances of you seeing all those stages are very low. So I'll start with the usual disclaimer. GitHub is obviously a really big company. What I'm sharing here is probably not going to be directly relevant to what you're working on. To this day, effectively all of our customer-facing traffic is served from our Rails monolith. That's backed by a few dozen supporting services. They're mostly written in Go at this point. I always like to share stats about our models, views, and controllers, and usually it's just some numbers, but this time I figured since I'm doing it every year, I should write a script that does it in time series. So I basically wrote something similar to Rails stats, and what it does is it checks out any Rails repository every month for the entire history of the repository. It puts it on a graph. So this is the growth of the github.com Rails monolith from inception to, I think I actually did it, I pulled this all in January. We have 5,000 models, we have 4,000 routes that render a unique page, and 2,100 controllers. And we have about 650 people in a given month, like unique humans contributing to this one code base. I've open sourced this script. There's the URL. I'd love to see you run it on your code base and send me the CSV or whatever it dumps out. But anyways, with that context out of the way, let's get to it. Today I'm going to talk about kind of 3 main lessons around UI architecture. One is that I believe native is the new baseline. Second one is that UI abstractions are a paradox. And the third is that front-end work costs 10 times what backend costs. So first, native is the new baseline. I'm guessing many of you have used GitHub for a long time. You have seen it change in front of your eyes, slowly but surely. But if you look at the code base, it's also gone through a lot of different transitions. If you browse our views directory, you can visualize it with a tool called Git of Theseus, and we had 2 million commits, and it took like several days on my really beefy computer to do it. But this is a retention analysis of all of our code. This is actually just all code, not just view code in our monolith. And what this basically shows is that each color represents what year a line of code was last touched. So you can see we have some code, maybe not anything from the inception, but we have some code that's really stuck around for a long time. And what this has really meant for us is that when we write code, we are carving it in stone. It's getting frozen in time when it lands. And that is until we basically just are forced to change it. And in my time, we've significantly raised our standards on how we build UI with the effect of making doing things the right way a lot more complex. So for example, we've made, and I've talked about this previous years, we've made significant efforts to improve the accessibility of our products, and that required very widespread changes to our UI. We've also worked really hard to improve our availability. And for a long time, we accepted some amount of UI regressions as normal. We didn't even really measure them. We just waited until someone would post, let's see, this is a video. Things like this on Twitter. It was generally accepted that we wouldn't catch these things, but that we could rely on our ability to quickly deploy or roll back to remediate a regression like this. That is no longer the case. We now consider UI bugs to be like any other bug, counting them against our availability scores if they're blocking someone from using the product. I did this a couple months ago. I shipped a bug that meant you couldn't SSO your personal access token. So our standards for availability are 3 nines. Can anyone here tell me how many hours of downtime in a year 3 nines is? Any guesses? 2 hours? It's longer than that. It's 8 hours. 8.5 hours is 3 nines. Okay, so 8.5. So think about how long it takes for you to deploy a code change in your application. Say you find a UI bug and it requires a code change. How long does it take for you to get that change to production? Well, for us, call it an hour, which means that we get 8 of those per year, even if it's a rollback, right? So in discussions with other peers in the industry, our availability and accessibility standards are really the exception to the rule. Most companies really don't prioritize them or certainly make them a standard. And what this can mean is that when people see the things we're doing, whether it's the products we ship or how we ship them, or when people come and work at GitHub from other companies, they really have to change their mental model of how we do things to understand what it's like to operate under these constraints. But beyond accessibility and availability, there's also really kind of this broader pressure of expecting GitHub to be more, I'll just use air quotes, app-like. I'm guessing many of you have seen this pressure play out in your front ends. And the first case that I really saw this was GitHub projects. Customers were asking us for functionality well beyond the feature set we had in projects. More broadly, we're seeing other companies in our space innovate with these more app-like experiences, both in the browser and increasingly inside like editors and IDEs, which has, of course, led us to adopting React. While we don't have plans to explicitly go out and rewrite GitHub in React, we're basically building everything that's new that you see in React, especially when we need that kind of like app-like behavior. And we made that decision a couple of years ago. Here's another part of that script that can, at least shows how we adopt React. We've added about 250 React routes that serve about half of the average pages, like unique pages, used by a given user in a week. So this means that most of what you're seeing on GitHub now is React. But I think the root cause of this pressure to be more app-like is actually really more broad than just like our specific niche. As software continues to be a bigger part of our lives, a new population of consumers is emerging. So according to Pew Research, 15% of US adults only access the internet through a mobile device. And this is actually one of the lower stats in the world. Various reports estimate that on mobile devices, 90% of internet usage is in applications. It's not in the browser. So if you're using apps all day for your user experience, that's the standard. It's not what you're seeing on the web. And the situation is really more stark depending on the country. So for example, in India, even in urban households, only 22% even have a computer, like a desktop or a laptop. And And in rural areas, it's actually 5%. So which is all to say that I believe mobile is the new baseline for user experience. We're trying to match, and the problem is that we're trying to match that experience with a tech stack that was built for displaying documents. And while the web has come a really long way, it wasn't built from the ground up for building these kind of rich applications that we would need to compete with native mobile. And I know I'm not the only person in this room who has desired to keep the web the way it was, but the times are changing. So I have a question for all of you. How many people here, you're planning a 1-week trip, let's say it's international, how many of you would do it only using your phone? So I've been told by younger people that use words like fire and lit, that is the quickest way to determine whether you are of our generation or younger. And I point that out with some humor to just maybe open your mind to the idea that your mental model of how people use the internet is no longer reflective of reality. Because for me, that's the truth that I've uncovered in my work, is that just because I believe something is a certain way doesn't mean that's true. So given that, consider whether in your industry, with your competitors, what is the baseline? What are the native experiences, and how do you stack up against them? So really, of all the ideas that I've truly seen through their whole life cycle, my time at GitHub, it's design systems. I literally built Vue Component. We built the original implementation of Primer Vue components, and we've now seen that go all the way through all those wonderful and terrible stages of maturity, now to the point where we're not using it a lot. So as our availability and accessibility pressures have mounted at the company, more and more teams have rightly looked to our design system to help them meet those standards. That's the whole point of a design system, is that it enables teams to do that. But it's really had the effect of putting the hopes and dreams of many of the company's UI-related goals on the shoulders of very few stressed out people. In this case, it's maybe a dozen engineers in the entire company handling our design system. And you can see this pressure in the very architecture of Primer. So for a long time, Primer was just a library of CSS classes, much like Bootstrap was and Tailwind is today. In fact, it was written by the creator of Bootstrap originally. But as we look to improve our availability and accessibility, we found that encapsulating styles was not enough. We also needed to encapsulate markup and behavior, which of course led us to component-driven abstractions in React and Vue components. But honestly, for us, it's really been a struggle, even at GitHub scale, to build and maintain our design system that meets our standards, especially in multiple implementations. And the reason is that Primer has become a victim of its own success. The more that people adopt it, the harder it is for us to change. So our experience has been the perfect example of Hiram's Law, which states that with a sufficient number of users of an API, it does not matter what you promise in the contract or in your documentation. All observable behaviors of your system will be depended on by somebody. And when that system is partially written in CSS, things get really bad. So for example, take our button component, right? Buttons are simple, but we have 5,000 of them in our monolith and 4,000 of them in Rails and about 1,000 in React. And they're sometimes used in ways that we don't anticipate or have tests for. And while we do what we can to isolate our styles, the global nature of CSS makes it difficult to have that level of confidence we need to sleep well at night when we're shipping even the smallest UI change or CSS change. Which means that making changes to the button are really hard to make confidently, no matter how small. Upgrading the version of Primer in GitHub.com, I think, is one of the worst jobs at the company, in my opinion. And while we've made a lot of strides towards reducing risk with a lot of things that are probably popping up in your head right now, like feature flags, end-to-end testing, we still rely a lot on manual click testing of these major releases. And what's really stuck out to me is that compared to very similarly shaped problems on the back end, we are so far behind when it comes to confidence in making changes. But I think there's a bigger problem. Why are we all making design systems? I can't help but feel that there's like a great broader duplication of effort that's just wasting human potential here. And to illustrate my point, look really closely. This is the same component documented in the Zendesk design system. Literally the information architecture, the names of the sections in the table of contents are similar. It's uncanny to me. And some of you might know where I'm going with this. I agree with Brad Frost, who is saying that it is time for a global design system. I would encourage you to read the many articles he's done. He's starting to work with some of the W3 committees on this problem. So what does this mean for all of you? I'm often asked when I come and speak, what should someone do about building their own design system from scratch? How should they go about making that decision? And I think it's pretty clear that my answer would be, don't do it. But a startup recently asked me, and they're like, how many components would you build? And they had a single designer for their entire company and like 6 engineers. And they were considering building a design system. So basically, their whole company was half the size of our design systems team. And here's what I told them. We can't afford to do it with a team twice your size. And even at our scale, we don't build all of our components ourselves. So for example, when you see any charts on GitHub, that's high charts. We use their front end. When you use any tables, like in the new GitHub projects, that is React table. We did not write that. We've even toyed with the idea of theming an existing design system when we need to add new components using something like Radix or Shoelace to pull in their existing work. Instead of having to like literally go in and say, okay, how do we make this type of component accessible and available ourselves? So that is to say, the UI abstraction paradox really is no joke. The cost of reinventing the wheel is very significant. And I would encourage you to reuse existing design systems whenever you can. So one of my favorite series of programming blog posts is the Falsehoods series. Has anyone seen the Falsehoods series? Here's some nodding, some clapping. So there's a series of articles called Falsehoods Programmers Believe About, and then a topic. So for example, falsehoods programmers believe about time. Any 24-hour period will always begin and end in the same day, or week, or month. There's also a good one about names. Turns out, of course, in researching this talk, there is an awesome list called Awesome Falsehoods, for those of you with more time on your hands than me. But I think there is an article missing from this list. I looked, there's no falsehoods programmers believe about UI. But it turns out there's one that I think would do a good job, and this is by Dave Rupert, and it's called UI is f of states raised to the n. So what do you think n is here? Well, he argues that it's about 64. So in this article, Rupert elaborates on the dozens, I think it's actually 63, of runtime inputs that can affect how a browser renders UI. Many of them which are outside of our control. So for example, browser extensions. I from time to time am involved in triaging just community bugs. Like when you guys file bugs with support, they sometimes come to me. Be nice. I would guess that like a third of them are from browser extensions. They aren't even our fault. And this is especially true as like we've switched to React, and like the way React handles like identifying elements is a little bit more opaque, so it becomes harder to like grease monkey your way through it. Anyways, this is madness coming from the backend world. Can you imagine if like your customer could change how your Ruby ran? Like, what? And like we're trying to push more complexity on the front end where this can all happen. So we run all of GitHub on one version of Ruby. Like literally one SHA of Ruby is for all of GitHub. But like on the front end, our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript runs on several different major browsers, across a matrix of hardware stacks, across several major versions of all of those things. And you'd think that with such a massive difference in runtime variety, that we would test our front-end code as thoroughly as possible, right? At least as thoroughly as our back-end code. So can anyone here raise their hand if they believe their company has the same or better front-end test coverage than back-end test coverage? Oh, are you hiring? You just got laid off? So if you have no tests on the back end and you have one front end test, I guess that means you qualify. Or if you have better front end test coverage, you literally actually can't afford it and your company goes bankrupt because, I don't think I need to tell all of you, like, browser tests suck. They're slow, they're flaky, especially when you compare them to back-end tests. But beyond that, I think that it's actually more structural. Like, our back-end code is more testable, so we write more tests for it. Before we had components, a lot of our tests were just clicking around in a browser. So we wrote them, at that kind of like system level. Thankfully, this is starting to change. With component-driven UI, we're quickly turning the corner. We have effectively total test coverage for our components at GitHub. In fact, we just basically auto-generate a test for you whenever you generate a new Vue component or React component. You kind of don't have a choice. But that isn't enough. And I think that's really due to how varied that front-end runtime can be. So I don't know how many of you are into the very computer sciencey side of things, but there is a lot of tooling and research around making mathematically provable backend code. One example of that is S3. I don't know why I have this up here. Did anyone know that was the S3 logo? No? You knew it, Dan. Yeah, you knew it, Dan. One person. You can, with math, prove that S3 is immune from certain failure modes as a backend service. In my research, there's I found one paper, actually, one mathematical paper, one research paper on, it's called formal verification. One paper. It was to formally verify that a cookie banner was being shown. So that's the only thing we apparently care about from the research standpoint in the front end world, is did the cookie banner display in the viewport? Can we prove that? So as our application has grown, so has the amount of front end complexity that we have to manage. So looking back at our graphs, the number of lines of front end code per contributor, which is this bottom one, was stable for over a decade until we started adopting React. This sign is concerning to me. Wouldn't you expect our UI code to become less complex over time, especially if we have tools like design systems that should be abstracting away our complexity? So one contributing factor that I've observed is that design is not bound by the same constraints as engineering. There's an imbalance of change cost between engineering and design. A designer can build a year's worth of work for an engineer in a week. And honestly, probably in an hour. I've seen it done. We have designs from years ago that were aspirational, that we're still just scratching the surface of building them. And I think that's really because there's so few natural limits that it's easy to build designs that are difficult for engineers to implement. But the reality for us is way more subtle. It's actually really uncommon for us to explicitly say, yes, deviate from primer, don't use primer. But because we are designing in an environment that is removed from the target medium, in our case we're using Figma, there's no guarantee that what can be designed can actually be built even from our design system, at least without compromises. And I think a real opportunity here is for us to stop using Figma to build those prototypes that get handed off and to instead build them with the components themselves. And really what it comes down to is that I believe even at our scale with all of our resources, we're really only successful when we intentionally allocate our complexity for where it's most necessary. And I'll give you some examples. So for GitHub, that might be diffs, right? This is a unique user interface you don't see many places in your day-to-day life. It might be something like four-dimensional drag and drop, where you drag and hold something and then something happens. Or maybe the quintessential piece of GitHub UI, the merge box. These kinds of UIs have little to no convention, and they often have unique accessibility characteristics that are really expensive to solve. But a lot of time, I would argue that our budget when it comes to UI complexity should be zero. We should build with what already exists. And I think our customers will actually prefer it. The people who use the software we build are likely interacting with dozens of other apps in any given day. Do we really want to expect people to have to relearn to do similar UI patterns every time they pick up a new application. Imagine if the car world that worked this way. If you were flying in for this conference and you rented a car and you're like, oh my gosh, I gotta learn how to accelerate again, right? Like, where's the brake? Like, and this is happening with touchscreens, I know a little bit. And I'll give you an example of this. E-commerce checkouts, right? Like, I live here in Colorado. How hard is it to get my address, guys? Like, how hard? Like, there's so many different ways to enter a US shipping address when it comes to UI. And imagine what this is like for someone who's using a screen reader, like encountering all these different labeled forms and whatnot. And this is actually a big reason why I love what Shopify is doing, because they're slowly eating all non-Amazon retail on the internet, so at least I can rely on their checkout form being predictable. And I have to say, it's really hard to say this in public because I have an art degree. I am a creative person. But I think that it's really easy for artists and designers to view everything as art when really what we're building is tools. Art is a great way to be creative, but it isn't we shouldn't be prioritizing creativity over usability. And what's really exhausting to me about this problem is that things could not be more different on the back end. We all in this room are here because we like Ruby, and I think a lot of us because we like Rails. And part of that is because we regularly use and improve those shared tools that already exist, kind of as a default rule. Like, you'd get in trouble if you went into a Ruby shop and said, okay, I'm just gonna build a new web framework from scratch. You get laughed out of the room. But but designs, people walk in and say, I'm gonna build a new design system from scratch, and everyone says, cool, let's do it, right? So as Rubyists, I think we're really good about working together to improve open source software. We contribute changes back to Rails, and I think the same should be true about UI frameworks and even browsers themselves. One of the most inspiring things I've seen in this space was my colleague Keith, who contributed 100 patches across 5 different browsers in 18 months. He now works for Firefox, of course. But you can do it. He started from not having a lot of knowledge of browsers, and he went in and fixed, really significant bugs that allowed us to remove code from GitHub. That was kind of the whole justification. Like, we'd have a workaround or something that said, oh, Safari does this thing. Well, he just went and fixed Safari. And then a year later, we dropped the workaround. So what can you do? I recommend thinking about UI complexity as something to budget for, and then spend it really wisely, only inventing as little as absolutely possible. Because if there's any lesson I've learned in working on UI architecture at GitHub, it's that the equivalent amount of code complexity in the end costs about 10 times as much on the front end as it does on the back end. So in conclusion, native is the new baseline. Consider how your app compares to your market competitor's native app experience. The UI abstraction paradox is no joke. Don't invent a design system, please. And front end costs 10 times back end, so budget very carefully. Thank you. And thanks to my peers for their peer review, Francis, Josh, and Jonathan. Good work. Any questions? I have, am I allowed 3 minutes, right? Am I allowed 3 minutes? Any questions? I go one of 2 directions. So the question was, if I had my way, would I force designers to submit designs as like in HTML or in React or whatever? Yes, or in the opposite direction, lower fidelity. Because I think the problem is it's the false sense of confidence you get from something that looks perfect but can't actually be built. So like Balsamic is a great version of this from back in the day, where it looks almost hand-drawn. It's like intentionally low fidelity, so as to not fool you into thinking that it can be built exactly as it is. So the question is if we standardize on design systems, how do you keep progressing on design? I think you do it through those one-off things where you say like, okay, I truly think I can make a more accessible whatever. Maybe, AI is a great example. Like, we have all these new UI patterns. We have not yet converged on a standard, although chat seems to be one of them. Yeah, I think there's room for experimentation, but I think that if you look at the thing I didn't point out is that if you compare our design systems to say Zendesk's, they both have 60 components. There's so much overlap. Yes, there's still room for invention, but the large majority should not be. I've heard Shad's CDN around work is something we kind of model. We also have a couple people who came from IBM who work with us now. Their design system is great. It's called Carbon, so it's a good one to model as well. So the question is that as used components, more, how does that affect the 10x multiplier? Absolutely, that is the way out of the trap. That's the whole argument, is that if you have a component system that you are actually utilizing without modification and workaround, that's the key thing. Because like the problem we face is that we have components that like will then design something that the component can't do. And then you're stuck in this trap of like, okay, do I not do what the designer said, or do I bolt on this functionality that maybe that would take much longer to do to the standard that the rest of the component was built to. So like, I think that's why ultimately having designers build with the existing components is the way out. Because then they're building within the confines of the current system versus aspiring to be beyond it. And then they get permission to go beyond it. Because if you don't, you end up in a different hell. Yeah. Anyways, that's all the time I have. Thank you guys.